Viewers, having discussed bill of exchange in my first video, I'm going to talk about promissory note in this video. Though promissory note has a few similarities with bill of exchange, but there are fundamental differences in both. Let us try to understand what promissory note is and how it differs from a bill of exchange. Negotiable Instruments Act 1881 of India defines a promissory note as an instrument in writing, not being a banknote or a currency note, containing an unconditional undertaking signed by the maker to pay a certain sum of money only to or to the order of a certain person or to the bearer of the instrument. See, there's a fundamental difference here. In case of a promissory note, the maker or the drawer is signing an unconditional undertaking to pay a certain sum of money, unlike bill of exchange, where the drawee was required to pay a certain amount of money on an agreed date. We will look into other differences in both of these credit instruments in more detail in a separate section. An important word of caution has to be noted. According to the Reserve Bank of India Act, a promissory note payable to the bearer is illegal. Parties. There are only two parties to a promissory note, a drawer and a drawee. However, there are other metaphors used for the same parties. For example, the drawer can also be called maker or promisor. Similarly, drawee can also be called payee or promisee. We noted one difference earlier, that in promissory note, it's the maker who makes an unconditional order that he will pay a certain amount to a certain person or the bearer, whereas in bill of exchange, it is the drawee who makes a promise to pay a certain amount on an agreed date. The other big difference between bill of exchange and promissory note is that in promissory note, acceptance of the drawee is not required because the maker of the promissory note himself promises to make the payment. In a nutshell, what does a maker of the promissory note do? Makes or draws a promissory note in favor of a drawee or payee, signs the promissory note, makes payment to the drawee or payee or promisee. Features of a promissory note. Features of a promissory note are more or less similar to what we covered in the bill of exchange. For example, it must be in writing. It must contain an unconditional promise to pay. The sum payable must be certain. It must be signed by the maker. It must be payable to a certain person. It should be properly stamped. Differences. There are 5 bases on which we can differentiate a promissory note from a bill of exchange. The 5 bases are drawer, parties involved, acceptance, payee, notice. Let us now look at these one by one in some detail. Drawer. In bill of exchange, it is drawn by a creditor who sold goods to another person, whereas in promissory note, it is the debtor who draws the bill. Parties. In bill of exchange, potentially there can be 3 parties, namely a drawer, a drawee, or a payee. In contrast, in promissory note, there are only 2 parties involved, a drawer and a payee. Acceptance. For bill of exchange, acceptance is must from the drawee, but it is not required in the case of promissory note. Payee. In bill of exchange, the drawer and payee can be same person, but in promissory note, the drawer cannot be payee. In fact, it's the drawer who has to make a payment to another person or payee. Notice. In bill of exchange, a notice of dishonor must be given by the holder of the bill to the drawer, but for promissory note, this kind of notice is not required.